The grand hall of the Galactic Council glittered with gold and crystal, a place built to show power and control. Every wall carried the banners of different alien empires, their colors burning bright under the soft white light. It was supposed to be a place of diplomacy and respect. But that day, it was filled with laughter. Thousands of delegates from across the galaxy sat in their seats, watching as grainy recordings of human battle tactics played on the central holoscreen. They laughed like it was a comedy show, pointing at the figures of human soldiers charging forward without fear, screaming their war cries as enemy fire rained down. The footage showed humans fighting like they didn't care about their lives, moving into danger with a kind of wild energy no other species dared to use. To the aliens, it was madness. To the humans, it was simply war. An insectoid ambassador tapped his claws against the table and let out a shrill laugh. "Look at them," he said, charging straight into plasma fire. No strategy. No sense of self-preservation. Humans fight like animals. A reptilian delegate sitting across from him hissed, his long tongue flicking in amusement. "They don't fight like animals," he replied. "Even animals know when to run. Humans run forward when they should be running away." The chamber erupted in laughter. One after another, delegates took turns mocking them. "They're too emotional. They're unpredictable. They're dangerous because they're stupid." An older alien ambassador slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the hall. "They act," he growled, "like they want to die." His voice carried a kind of disgust that made several others laugh even louder. The holoscreen shifted to another scene. Human soldiers fighting through impossible odds, outnumbered 5-1. Their ships battered and burning, but still pushing forward. "See," another alien said between laughs. "They don't retreat. They throw their lives away for nothing." But not everyone in the hall was laughing. Among the rows of loud delegates sat a few older figures, silent and pale. They were old enough to remember. They had seen this kind of laughter before. Decades ago, before the Terran Wars, the Council had laughed at humans in the same way. They had called them weak, chaotic, emotional. And then the humans had answered. Entire fleets had vanished. Empires that mocked them were now only names in history records. Those who remembered leaned back in their chairs, their hands tightening around the edges. The sound of laughter felt like a storm about to break. The Speaker of the Council raised his voice to restore order. "Enough," he said with a small smile. "We are not here to glorify them. We are here to assess their threat. And as you can see, their tactics are wild and uncontrolled. No discipline. No fear. This is why humanity can never be taken seriously as a major power." His words only encouraged more mocking. A tall crystalline alien stood and said, "They act without logic. A species like that will destroy itself long before it ever destroys anyone else." But far away, beyond the shining walls of the council chamber, beyond their polished speeches and mocking tones, the void of space stirred. On the edge of the Sol system, ancient Terran beacons, silent for decades, began to blink. They were old war signals, long thought to be forgotten. Their pulse echoed across the dark, low and steady like the heartbeat of a sleeping beast. The council sensors picked up the signals within minutes, but no one in the chamber cared. A few board analysts saw the alert flash on their consoles and filed it away as routine military exercises. One of them even laughed. "Humans love their war games," he said to his colleague, "always pretending to be dangerous." The recordings on the holoscreen shifted again. This time they showed footage from a past war, where human ships, outnumbered and cornered, had charged head-on into an alien fleet. Instead of retreating, the humans had rammed their ships into enemy vessels, sacrificing entire crews to cripple fleets. The delegates pointed and laughed again. "Madness," one of them said. "Pure madness." Another added, "No sane commander would ever make those decisions. Only humans." In the shadows of the back row, a scarred alien general who had once fought against the Terrans stared at the screen without laughing. He remembered the Battle of Vera, where 3 human destroyers had charged into a fleet 10 times their size and shattered it. It wasn't luck. It wasn't madness. It was something else. Something terrifying. "You're all fools," he muttered under his breath. "You think it's insanity because you've never been on the other end of it." The laughter in the hall grew louder, echoing off the walls like a celebration. The speaker lifted his hand again, smirking. "This is why the humans can be contained. This is why they will never truly threaten the galaxy." The delegates nodded, pleased with themselves, comfortable in their belief that humanity was something to mock, not something to fear. They didn't notice that several older members had stopped watching the holoscreen entirely. They were staring at the live feed from the frontier. They saw the blinking signals. They recognized what they meant. Hundreds of light-years away, in the cold silence of deep space, human ships stirred beneath black covers. Old war fleets long thought disbanded were coming alive again. Silent factories on hidden stations lit up like stars, engines roaring after years of darkness. In the command chambers of Earth, no laughter was heard. There were no speeches, no broadcasts, only orders given in low, controlled voices. Humanity didn't argue with the galaxy. Humanity didn't explain itself. Humanity moved. Back in the council chamber, a young delegate from a small world smirked and leaned back in his chair. "If humans are so dangerous, why haven't they done anything for years?" he said. The older general turned his scarred face toward him, his single eye dark and steady. "Because they don't act until someone gives them a reason," he said. And someone just did. The young alien laughed, thinking the old soldier was exaggerating. But the general didn't join him. His fingers tapped the table slowly, like a clock counting down. He knew exactly what those war beacons meant. The humans weren't sending warnings. They never did. When the beacons came online, it meant they were done talking. It meant fleets were moving. The council had mocked their madness before. And each time, the stars had burned. They just didn't know it yet, but their laughter had already started the countdown. Somewhere in the void, the Terran fleets were awakening. And this time, there would be no warnings, no negotiations, and no mercy. The council chamber had returned to its usual order after the laughter died down. But outside those glittering walls, unease was beginning to spread like a thin, invisible fog. The mocking words were still fresh in the air, but in the silent corners of the galaxy, on forgotten edges of star systems and cold frontier stations, something was moving. Humanity's war beacons, those ancient signals no one had heard for decades, kept pulsing in the void. Each pulse was a heartbeat. Each heartbeat was a promise. But the council didn't understand yet. They thought it was just another human bluff. On a border listening station near the rim, two alien technicians stared at their screens. They had picked up the faint signal hours ago, a repeating Terran code. It was old, older than both of them combined. "It's probably just an old relay turning back on," one of them said with a tired shrug. The other didn't answer. He knew enough history to know this wasn't just a relay. The code was an ancient Terran mobilization pattern, the same one they'd used during the Black Dawn War, the same one that had ended 3 empires. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. "We should report this," he whispered. His partner gave a nervous laugh. "Report what? A ghost signal? The council won't care." And they were right. When the report reached the Central Monitoring Division of the council, it was buried under routine security logs. No alarms. No special alerts. Just another blinking file tagged non-urgent. But while the council dismissed it, others did not. Far from the shining core worlds, in the quiet darkness of Terran space, massive hangar doors slowly creaked open. Ships that had been hidden in cold storage for years came back to life. Black hulls emerged from asteroid fields like predators lifting their heads from a long sleep. Automated shipyards, built for a day the galaxy thought would never come, began to hum with life. Hundreds of thousands of silent drones swarmed like silver insects, reactivating warship cores, repairing hulls, and arming weapons. Humanity was waking up, and it didn't need to speak to tell the galaxy what that meant. On one council border world, a group of alien officers gathered around a holomap. Their commander, a lean creature with gray skin and sharp eyes, frowned as new sensor readings appeared. "Something's moving," he said quietly, "out there in Terran space." One of his lieutenants laughed nervously. They don't have that kind of power anymore. Their fleets have been quiet for years. The commander didn't laugh. Do you know why their fleets have been quiet? The lieutenant shook his head. The commander leaned closer, his voice low. Because they don't start wars. They finish them. At first, the movements were small. Minor signals vanishing from the frontier. Merchant ships reporting strange black shadows drifting between systems. Civilian routes near Terran space growing quiet. But within days, the pattern was clear to anyone who had seen this before. Humanity's silence wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of sharpening blades. In the Council's defense network, a group of strategists met in a steel-walled room beneath the Grand Hall. None of them were laughing. They had lived through the Terran campaigns decades ago. They had seen what happened to anyone who underestimated humans. A holomap hovered above the table, dotted with red indicators representing systems going dark. This is how it starts, one of the strategists said. First the signals. Then the silence. Then, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. They all knew what came next. One of the younger generals, too young to remember those wars, folded his arms and scoffed. You're letting old stories scare you. Their fleets are outdated. Their ships are scattered. Even if they mobilize, we have the numbers now. We control the sky. The older strategist, a scarred, heavy-voiced alien, looked at him with a cold, almost pitying stare. And that, he said slowly, is exactly what they want you to believe. On the frontier, civilian ships were starting to flee. They didn't wait for orders. Traders and miners had learned long ago that when human space went quiet, something was coming. They shut down their colonies, abandoned their stations, and vanished into the stars. By the time the Council noticed the exodus, entire trade routes near human borders were empty. Meanwhile, on the edge of human space, the beacons changed their rhythm. The heartbeat grew faster, more intense. For the few who could read Terran military code, the meaning was clear: mobilization underway. Fleets weren't just waking up, they were assembling. In the command bunker beneath the Council's capital, the speaker was finally informed. The glowing projection of the Terran border hovered over his desk, dotted with new movements. This is nothing, he said dismissively at first. They are rattling their chains. Let them. But an aide nervously pointed at one particular system where a massive cluster of energy spikes had been detected. Sir, the aide said, that's not a signal. That's power output from a fleet. A big one. The room fell silent. Even the speaker stopped breathing for a second. For years, everyone had assumed the Terran fleets had been decommissioned. But that energy reading didn't belong to a few ships. It belonged to hundreds. Maybe more. Elsewhere, alien merchants whispered in fear. Old veterans drank in silence. Some worlds quietly began recalling their fleets, not to fight, but to hide. They remembered how fast Terran retaliation had come in the past. How it started quietly, like this, with shadows on the sensors and empty trade lanes. Then, when everyone finally realized what was happening, it was too late. One alien general stood before a live feed of the Terran border. The beacons pulsed steadily, like the slow beat of a war drum. He had fought them once when he was young. He had seen their ships cutting through his fleets like blades through paper. He whispered to no one, "They're coming." But the council chamber remained blind. Blinded not by ignorance, but by arrogance. "They're humans," one ambassador said during the next session. "They bark, they scream, but they're not dangerous anymore." Another added, "Let them move their ships. It will keep them busy." None of them noticed the quiet terror in the eyes of the older generals sitting at the edge of the chamber. None of them saw the faint trembling in their hands. They were remembering old battlefields, the blinding light of human war engines, the way Terran fleets moved like they had already won before the fight began. The laughter from the first day had already begun to fade. Something heavy was creeping into the air, a feeling no one wanted to name out loud. Somewhere deep in Terran space, far from any star, a massive shipyard came alive. A single black dreadnought lifted slowly from its dry dock, its engines lighting the void. Hundreds of cruisers and destroyers surrounded it, falling into perfect formation. The human fleet was no longer a rumor. It was real. It was awake. And it was coming. The Council didn't realize it yet, but the moment they mocked humanity, their countdown had already begun. The silence came slowly at first, like a fog no one noticed creeping across the galaxy. Then, within days, it became impossible to ignore. Whole sectors near human space began to dim on the Council's star charts. Outposts that once hummed with communication fell quiet one after another. Trade signals died mid-transmission. Patrols disappeared without distress calls. And worst of all, no one saw a single human ship. The void gave no answers, only silence. That silence was louder than any fleet could ever be. In the Council's central command complex, dozens of alien officers crowded around a glowing holomap that showed the edge of human territory. Red markers flickered like dying embers, each one representing a system that had just gone dark. A nervous lieutenant with shaking hands leaned over the table and whispered, "They're cutting off the border." His voice barely carried through the room, but it was enough to make the others glance at him in dread. Another officer barked back, "That's not possible. Humans don't have that kind of reach anymore." But the blinking lights didn't care what anyone believed. One by one, the outer stations were disappearing. The Speaker of the Council strode into the room, his cloak dragging behind him like a royal banner. "Report," he demanded. The senior general, a tall, steel-blue alien with old battle scars carved across his face, stepped forward. "We've lost contact with 11 systems in the last 36 hours, he said, his tone flat but heavy. "No distress calls. No debris fields. Just gone." The speaker frowned, trying to sound confident. "Malfunctions." The general's eyes were cold. "No. This is coordinated. It's what they do." Across the galaxy, rumors spread faster than the Council could control them. Merchant captains whispered about seeing black silhouettes slipping between the stars, massive shapes that vanished before scanners could lock on. A miner ship reported seeing a wall of darkness moving past their asteroid belt, engines dead silent. No one had proof. But no one needed proof. The veterans knew what those shadows meant. Humanity was no longer just stirring. Humanity was already moving. On one distant colony world near the border, alarms wailed in the night sky as orbital sensors caught their first glimpse of them. At first, it looked like a distortion in the starlight, a ripple across the void. Then the stars themselves seemed to vanish. It wasn't space bending. It was a fleet. A human fleet so large it blotted out entire constellations. There were no warning transmissions, no declarations, no calls for surrender. Just the low hum of engines older than most civilizations in the galaxy. Black ships, sharp and silent, moved in perfect formation. The colony governor fell to his knees before the feed cut out. The next day, the system was gone from the Council's network. In the shadows of the Council Hall, older generals and admirals who had fought against Terrans before gathered behind closed doors. They no longer tried to convince the younger ambassadors with words. They knew this feeling. They had seen the same pattern before every Terran retaliation. Silence, shadow, and then the storm. One grizzled admiral with silver implants stared at the holomap and said, "They're not just mobilizing. They're already in position." Another added, "They've been ready for this longer than we've realized." Meanwhile, at the edge of human space, the massive shipyards roared with life. Dreadnoughts the size of cities floated into position like silent giants. Escort cruisers slid into formation. Squadrons of fighter carriers swarmed the dark like a storm cloud. And at the center of it all stood one ship, larger than all the rest. The Horizon's Wrath, the flagship of the Terran Strategic Fleet, powered its engines for the first time in 40 years. Its black hull shimmered faintly under distant starlight, absorbing more than it reflected, like a predator cloaked in the dark. No one outside Terran space had ever seen this ship and lived to tell the tale. Back at the Council chamber, the panic began to crack through the polished floor of arrogance. Emergency meetings stretched through the night. Ambassadors shouted at each other, accusing their neighbors of overreacting, of fearmongering. "Humans are unstable, not unstoppable," one of them shouted. They'll bark. They won't bite. But their voices were trembling now. They were starting to understand what the veterans had always known. Humans didn't bark. Humans moved in silence, and by the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already too late. The Council Defense Network sent out small scout fleets to the border to assess the situation. None of them returned. Not a single signal. Not a single wreck. Just more silence. One admiral slammed his fist against the holo table. "They're not fighting us," he said. "They're erasing us." At the same time, subtle changes began to ripple through neutral space. Smaller empires and trading guilds quietly recalled their fleets, shut down their trade routes, and locked their borders. They knew better than to get in the way when humans moved. "This isn't war," one guildmaster whispered to another. "This is judgment." Then, a week after the first beacons were detected, the silence finally broke. Every major council capital received the same transmission at the exact same time. There was no face, no voice, no long speech, just a symbol. A glowing red Terran emblem, an old war sigil burned into galactic memory. Under it, a single line of text appeared in every language simultaneously: "We are coming." That was all. In the control rooms, screens froze. Delegates stared, their mouths dry. Admirals and generals who had fought them before felt their stomachs drop. One of them whispered, "They haven't used that sigil since the siege of Velkar." Another muttered, "They're not threatening us. They're announcing it." In response, the council scrambled. Fleets were recalled from deep space to the core worlds. Defensive stations were armed for war. Millions of soldiers were drafted overnight. It was chaos. Every empire shouted different orders, but no one truly knew what to do. They had mocked humanity as reckless, unpredictable, and insane. But now they were realizing something far more dangerous. Unpredictability is terrifying when it belongs to someone who never bluffs. Meanwhile, on the outer rim, the Terran fleets advanced. They didn't come in waves or chaos. They came like a storm front, steady, unstoppable, perfect. Black dreadnoughts glided through the void in formation so precise it looked like an army of machines, not men. Their engines burned cold blue, their communications channels silent. No hails, no negotiations. Just their presence filling the void like a judgment too heavy to run from. A council border station saw them first. The commander, a grizzled alien with trembling hands, stared at the incoming formation on his monitor. His junior officer whispered, "How many ships?" The commander's voice cracked as he answered, "All of them." The storm was no longer coming. It was already here. And somewhere in the heart of the Terran flagship, among endless ranks of steel, a calm voice gave a single order, one that would echo across the galaxy and shatter every illusion the Council had ever built: advance. The night sky above the Council border world burned with starlight, until the stars began to vanish. One by one, their brilliance was swallowed by a moving wall of darkness, a fleet so vast it looked like the void itself had come alive. Sensors screamed across defense stations, their alarms piercing through the silence. The operators stared at their monitors in disbelief, watching as hundreds of black Terran warships slipped out of the void in perfect, terrifying formation. These weren't ships stumbling in or approaching with hesitation. They moved like a blade sliding into its sheath, quiet, smooth, inevitable. The commander of the border defense fleet stood on the bridge of his flagship, frozen for a heartbeat. Then he forced himself to speak, though his voice trembled. "How many?" he demanded. The sensor officer hesitated, his throat dry, before finally whispering, "We can't count them. The scanners can't lock on all of them at once. They're everywhere." The commander turned toward the viewport. He didn't need a scanner to know what was happening. Outside, rows upon rows of Terran dreadnoughts stretched across the stars, forming a line so precise it looked as if the universe itself had drawn it with a ruler. No fleet had ever moved like this. No fleet dared to. The first Terran ship emerged fully from the black, a massive dreadnought, its hull as dark as the void, its running lights glowing faint blue. It was so large that it blocked out the planet's sun, casting the entire battlefield in a cold, shadowy light. Behind it, cruisers and destroyers glided into place without a single wasted movement. The alien officers on the border station were used to fleet's broadcasting warnings or demands. They expected speeches, ultimatums, negotiations. But the Terran fleet said nothing. They simply stood there in silence, their weapons systems already locked and tracking. On the ground below, millions of civilians looked up at the night sky and saw nothing but black ships hanging above their world like a storm frozen in place. The silence itself became suffocating. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence before impact, the silence of something that didn't need to speak to prove its power. Back at the Council's central command hub, a storm of panic had erupted. Dozens of alien admirals screamed into their headsets as live feeds of the Terran fleet filled the room. One ambassador slammed his hands against the table. "Why aren't they broadcasting anything?" he shouted. An older general, one of the few who had fought Terrans in the past, answered without looking up from the screen. "Because they don't need to. This is the message." Every monitor in the room displayed the same terrifying image. A Terran Armada surrounding the border world like a ring of steel. A single dreadnought drifted to the front, its hull marked with the Crimson War sigil, the same symbol the galaxy had seen once before during the siege of Velkar. That siege had wiped 3 empires off the map in under 48 hours. That was the story every child in the galaxy had grown up hearing. The Terrans didn't issue ultimatums. They didn't negotiate after being mocked. They simply came. On the bridge of the Council's defense fleet, the commander's officers were already panicking. One shouted, "We should open a channel." Another yelled, "They're not responding to any hails." The commander's voice shook as he whispered, "Of course they're not." He had heard the stories too. He knew what was coming. Terrans never talked when the fleets arrived. They acted. And then the silence broke. Not with words. Not with warnings. With movement. Hundreds of Terran ships rotated into perfect firing position in unison, like a single creature drawing breath. It was so synchronized, so precise, that the alien crews watching felt their stomachs tighten. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't a show of force. This was control. Cold, flawless control. The Council fleet scrambled to form a defensive line, their formations loose and shaky compared to the Terran wall pressing against them. One junior officer screamed, "They've locked on us," as targeting alarms blared across the bridge. A single pulse cut through the dark. It wasn't a weapon. Not yet. It was a long-range Terran beacon broadcasting a short, coded message on every frequency at once. The translation appeared on every ship, station, and command post in seconds. "We warned you once. You laughed. You won't laugh again." The Council fleet commander's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of his console. "Weapons ready," he muttered, though he knew it wouldn't matter. His entire life, he had believed in the Council's strength, in its massive fleets, advanced defenses, and endless soldiers. But looking out at the Terran Armada, he understood something that the Council had forgotten. Terrans weren't dangerous because of their numbers. They were dangerous because they always finished what they started. A young ensign shouted, "Multiple energy spikes." The commander turned his gaze toward the largest Terran dreadnought. Its forward batteries began to glow faint blue, then shifted into a deep, burning crimson. The energy signature was unlike anything the Council had seen since the war decades ago. The commander whispered, "God help us," but no God answered. The first shot fired wasn't a warning. It was a surgical strike. A beam of compressed plasma energy erupted from the Terran flagship, slicing through the nearest Council defense platform like it was made of paper. There was no explosion, just silence and a single blinding flash. The platform was gone before anyone realized it had been hit. Then another beam followed. And another. The Terran fleet wasn't attacking wildly. Each shot was calculated, removing shields, silencing command posts, cutting off communications. Within minutes, the entire defense network was blind and deaf. Back at the Council's war room, voices overlapped in panic. "They are disabling us. We can't get reinforcements in time. Where is the speaker?" No one had a plan. The Council had spent decades mocking Terran madness but had forgotten that their so-called madness was also their greatest weapon. Where other species hesitated, Terrans acted with terrifying precision. Where others built walls, Terrans built blades. The border fleet finally fired back, but their formation was broken, their shots scattered like panicked hands trying to fight a storm. Terran ships moved like predators among prey. They didn't just shoot to destroy, they shot to dismantle. Engines, reactors, bridges, everything that made a ship fight was stripped away. Alien crews screamed over comms, their voices cut short one by one. It wasn't a battle. It was a dissection. Civilians on the planet below stared up at the sky as lines of light streaked across the darkness. The ground rumbled beneath them as defense satellites exploded one after another. The Terran fleet didn't fire on the planet itself. They didn't need to. Breaking the Council's fleets was enough. The world was already theirs. Meanwhile, in the Grand Hall of the Council, ambassadors shouted at each other as the live feed of the battle played on every wall. Some demanded to surrender, others screamed to retaliate. The speaker slammed his hands on the table. "Enough!" he roared. But even he couldn't hide the fear in his voice. His advisors leaned in close. "They didn't come here to negotiate," one of them whispered. "They came to remind us." The speaker's mouth went dry. "Remind us of what?" The old general who had fought them long ago answered quietly, his voice carrying the weight of history. "That humanity doesn't bluff." Back at the front, the border fleet was gone. The Terran ships drifted in formation, untouched, their hulls glowing faintly under the light of the dying sun. Not a single alien ship dared to approach. The dreadnought at the center tilted slightly, as if surveying the wreckage it had left behind. Then, in perfect synchronization, the entire Terran Armada began to move forward again, deeper into Council space. There were no speeches, no cheers, no mercy. The storm was not just at their door anymore. It was marching toward their capital. And somewhere, deep inside the Terran flagship, the commander gave a single order in a calm voice: continue. The galaxy had mocked human madness. Now, they were beginning to understand it wasn't madness at all. It was precision sharpened into something unstoppable. The void above the ruined border world still burned faint red from the fading light of destroyed Council ships. The debris fields drifted silently, cold and weightless, like the scattered bones of something that never stood a chance. Not a single Terran ship had fallen. Not one. And as the dust of the battle settled, the true terror began. Terran fleets didn't linger on victories. They advanced. Always forward. Far beyond the shattered line, the rest of the Council's fleets were scrambling to form a defense. Dozens of star systems had received the emergency signal: Terran fleets inbound. The message spread like wildfire, igniting panic across military command centers, trade routes, and political halls. For years, they had mocked human recklessness, calling them wild and unpredictable. Now, as entire battle groups fell silent one after another, no one was laughing. On the flagship of the Council's first defensive armada, Admiral Kessick gripped the edge of the holotable so tightly his claws cut into the metal. His eyes darted over the incoming data streams, fleet movements, casualty reports, and worst of all, the speed of the Terran advance. "They are not even slowing down," his second-in-command whispered, voice trembling. "They're burning through entire sectors in hours." "They are not burning anything," Kessick said coldly. "They are cutting us apart." The Terran advance wasn't chaotic. It was horrifyingly methodical. They didn't waste resources destroying cities or stations unnecessarily. They hit only what mattered: military outposts, relay hubs, fleet yards, and strategic choke points. The Council had built its strength on controlling communications and trade routes, but the Terrans weren't trying to occupy. They were slicing through those arteries like a surgeon cutting off blood flow to the heart. Thousands of Council ships formed a massive defensive wall around the next key sector, a fortress system known as Karath Prime. It was the Council's pride, with 3 fortified moons, orbital gun platforms, shield nets spanning half a light-year, and a fleet of nearly 9,000 warships. No force in recorded history had ever breached it. The Admiralty called it unbreakable. But as the Terran Armada appeared on their long-range sensors, those words felt empty. On the Council flagship, tactical officers shouted updates. Terran fleets detected, multiple groups emerging from slipspace. How many? We don't know. They're using spread entry patterns. There's no fixed point. One after another, black warships slipped from the dark, surrounding Karath Prime like shadows closing in on prey. The Terrans didn't form a straight line like most fleets. They formed a sphere, trapping the defenders inside like a beast cornering its kill. The planetary defense grid came online, a web of glowing shields and heavy cannons lighting up the night. Council admirals shouted over comms, their voices loud but brittle. Fire on approach vectors. Lock every cannon on their flagships. Massive energy beams cut through space as the Council unleashed the full power of Karath Prime. Entire squadrons of Terran ships vanished under the blinding light of concentrated fire. For a heartbeat, the defenders cheered. Maybe this time would be different. Then, through the fading smoke, the Terran fleet kept moving. The destroyed ships weren't gone. What the Council thought were hits were decoy projections, advanced light-bending hulls designed to soak or redirect fire. The real fleet emerged behind the defenders' formation like wolves inside a pen. Keswick's eyes widened. They're already inside, he whispered. The counterattack came with terrifying precision. Terran dreadnoughts unleashed wave after wave of kinetic rounds that moved so fast they ripped through shields like thin cloth. Their destroyers moved like liquid shadows, cutting supply ships in half before they could react. Council formations fell apart almost immediately. In a few minutes, the proud, unbreakable wall became a collapsing mess of panicked transmissions and burning ships. On the bridge of Keswick's flagship, alarms screamed from every direction. We've lost the third moon's defense grid. The eastern flank is collapsing. They're taking the shield nexus. Keswick felt the air grow cold around him. He could hear his crew's breaths turning ragged, their hands shaking at the controls. It wasn't just fear of death. It was the realization that they were fighting something they didn't understand. Terrans weren't following any standard playbook. Every time the Council tried to regroup, the Terrans were already there, anticipating, adapting, striking again. Out in the void, Terran fighter wings swarmed across the battlefield like a black tide. They didn't just shoot. They cut through enemy formations, coordinated like a single mind. Council pilots tried to counter but were overwhelmed. They're everywhere, one screamed before his signal went dead. Within 2 hours, the Karath Prime defense line was broken. The final blow came from the Terran flagship, a colossal vessel unlike anything the Council had ever faced. Its main gun pulsed with crimson light, energy building like a star being born. One of Keswick's officers screamed, "They're targeting the shield core." The dreadnought fired. A single beam of light tore through the planetary shield, split the moon's reactor station in half, and silenced Karath Prime's entire defense grid in one shot. Back at the Council's war room, hundreds of alien leaders watched the live feed. They had believed Karath Prime would be their rallying point, their symbol of strength. Instead, they watched in silence as their strongest fortress world fell in less than 3 hours. No speeches, no negotiations, just precision, speed, and overwhelming force. One ambassador collapsed into his chair and whispered, This is not war. This is extermination." In the capital, chaos exploded. Civilians stormed evacuation ports. Fleets abandoned their stations, refusing to face the Terran Armada head-on. A few generals screamed for counterattacks, but their words sounded weak. The older veterans didn't even argue. They knew the truth. The moment the Terrans began to move, the war had already been decided. On the bridge of the Horizon's Wrath, the Terran fleet commander stood at the front viewport, hands clasped behind his back, watching the Council's fortress world burn. His officers worked silently around him, every movement exact, every action part of a larger, practiced dance. They didn't celebrate. They didn't gloat. This wasn't a moment of pride. It was duty. A soft tone echoed through the bridge. One of his officers turned to him and said quietly, "Karath Prime is neutralized. No survivors in the defense grid. The fleet is retreating toward the core worlds." The commander gave a small nod. "Then we follow." Outside, the Terran Armada pivoted with machine-like precision and accelerated deeper into Council territory. No speeches. No threats. Just the silent march of inevitability. Behind them, Karath Prime drifted in ruins, a place that had once been called unbreakable, now nothing more than a graveyard. Word of the fall spread faster than the fleet itself. Worlds that had mocked humanity just days earlier now whispered their name like a curse. Border colonies began surrendering without a fight. Military officers started abandoning posts before the Terrans even arrived. The laughter that had once filled the grand hall of the council was gone, replaced by a silence so thick it suffocated. The speaker of the council stared at the war table, his claws shaking as he watched red icons, representing their fleets, blink out one after another. He could no longer deny what everyone else had already realized. Humanity wasn't acting like a mad animal. They were acting like something far worse, a force that had already decided the ending. And they were not done. The fleets were still coming. The night sky above the council's capital burned like a living storm. Countless alien eyes stared upward as the darkness filled with motion, silent, steady, cold. The Terran fleet had arrived. Not as raiders. Not as negotiators. But as a wall of black steel stretching across the void, swallowing the stars themselves. The glow from the capital's defense grid lit the atmosphere like a nervous heartbeat, but everyone on the ground knew the truth. Karath Prime had fallen. The border fleets had been erased. Every stronghold they trusted was now just smoke drifting through the galaxy. The Terran Armada didn't rush. It didn't need to. It hung there, surrounding the entire system like a fist closing slowly. Dreadnoughts the size of cities glided into orbit, forming a perfect ring around the planet. Their hulls reflected nothing, only absorbed the light like hungry shadows. Escort cruisers and carriers shifted into formation with a precision that made the entire defense network look clumsy. In the council's high tower, the speaker stood at the window with trembling hands, watching humanity's black fleets take their positions. For years, he had laughed at stories of Terran madness. He had called them reckless, unpredictable, weak. But this was not madness. This was control. This was power wrapped in silence. Down in the Central Defense Command, alarms screamed as thousands of technicians scrambled to respond. Generals shouted orders, fleets mobilized, and defense stations opened fire. The skies lit up with energy bolts from orbital cannons and planetary defense batteries. But the Terran ships didn't flinch. Their shields drank in the fire like rain against a fortress wall. A single Terran dreadnought tilted its nose slightly, locked onto a gun platform, and fired. A streak of white-blue energy ripped through the platform in one clean shot. It didn't explode, it simply ceased to exist. "Dear stars," one alien officer whispered on the defense bridge. "They're not attacking, they're dismantling us." In the grand hall of the council, chaos was erupting. Ambassadors screamed over each other. Some demanded surrender, others shouted for resistance, and a few simply stood in silence, pale and shaking. The speaker slammed the central podium with his claw. "Order," he roared, but his voice carried no weight anymore. Fear hung over the chamber like smoke. A veteran general stepped forward, his voice rough like sand. "They're already here. Whatever we decide now won't matter." The speaker turned on him. "We still have fleets. We still have the capital defense network." The general met his eyes with a dead stare. Karath Prime had more. It lasted 2 hours. Silence fell like a hammer. Above the planet, the Terran fleet began to move. Not fast, not frenzied, just steady. It was the kind of movement that didn't need words. Thousands of ships rotated in perfect harmony, creating attack formations that cut through the void like blades. The alien defense fleet, once the pride of the council, looked scattered, desperate, and fragile in comparison. They fired first. They always did. A storm of energy fire poured into the black wall. But the Terrans didn't return fire immediately. They let the enemy's fear grow. They let them realize it wasn't enough. And when that realization finally settled, when the panic in every ship became thick enough to feel through the comm lines, Terrans struck. A wave of kinetic bombardment swept across the orbital layer. Hundreds of alien warships shattered under impacts they never even saw coming. Terran strike cruisers moved through the battlefield like sharks in dark water, picking off key vessels with impossible precision. Communication hubs fell silent within minutes. Command bridges went dark. Entire formations vanished like they had never been there. The alien defense commanders tried to give orders, but their fleets were no longer responding. "They're cutting our command chain," someone screamed. "We can't coordinate." On the ground, sirens wailed through the capital city as civilians flooded the streets, their faces turned to the sky. Above them, black Terran ships hovered in orbit like judgment itself. The Council's last line of defense, the planetary shield, came online with a blinding flash. For a moment, people cheered, believing their world might hold. But in the war room, the generals already knew better. One of them muttered, "That shield was designed to stop fleets like ours, not theirs." And they were right. A single Terran dreadnought, larger than any the Council had ever faced, drifted forward. Its hull bore no emblem, no name. It didn't need one. This was the Horizon's Wrath. It angled toward the shield generator at the northern pole and began charging its main cannon. The energy buildup was so intense that the planetary sensors registered it as a new star forming in orbit. Across the capital, people stared at the glowing light in the sky and fell silent. Even the speaker, high in his tower, felt his knees weaken. Then the cannon fired. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't even a roar. It was a single, clean beam that cut through the planetary shield like silk. The entire defense grid shut down in less than 4 seconds. The shield didn't fail slowly. It simply ceased to exist. The Council's last line of hope was gone before anyone could even process it. On the command bridge of the lead defense ship, Admiral Keswick whispered in disbelief, "We just lost everything." The Terrans didn't bombard cities. They didn't scorch the world beneath them. They didn't need to. They had already won. With the shield gone, their fleet surrounded the capital like a dark crown. Dropships and assault carriers moved silently toward the surface, their engines barely audible, their movements precise. The Council had spent centuries building their power. Humanity took it apart in a day. Inside the Grand Hall, panic turned to chaos. Ambassadors fled their seats, guards shouted, and alarms echoed through every corridor. The speaker stumbled back against the wall, watching the live feed as Terran landing craft broke through the atmosphere. "This can't be happening," he whispered. "They are humans. They can't." The old general standing beside him cut him off. "They can. They warned us with silence. We answered with laughter." Moments later, the landing craft touched down on the outskirts of the capital. Armored Terran soldiers emerged like shadows from the storm. Their black armor reflected nothing, their visors glowed faint blue, and their boots struck the ground with a calm rhythm that made every heart tremble. They didn't fire wildly. They didn't speak. They advanced like inevitability itself. Council security forces fired desperately, but Terran lines didn't break. Their formation swallowed the defenders like a tide consuming sand. Within the hour, the Grand Hall itself was surrounded. Terran soldiers walked through the shattered gates in silence. The Council guards had thrown down their weapons long before they arrived. Inside the chamber, the ambassadors who once mocked humanity now stood pale and shaking, their voices gone. The speaker fell to his knees as the lead Terran officer stepped forward. No speech, no gloating, just a single data crystal placed at his feet. The officer's calm, filtered voice echoed through the hall. "This is what happens when you mistake restraint for weakness." Then the soldiers turned and left. The fleet outside didn't fire a single shot at the city. They didn't need to. The capital had already surrendered without an order being given. Across the galaxy, transmissions of the event spread like a storm. Every world, every empire, every leader watched as the Council, the most powerful force in the galaxy, was brought to its knees by a fleet they once called reckless and insane. No empire dared to move. No one dared to speak. The silence after the fall of the Council was heavier than the roar of war. On the bridge of the Horizon's Wrath, the Terran commander stared down at the quiet world below. An officer approached. "All objectives secured. Council fleets are gone. Resistance has collapsed. The commander gave a single nod. Good. Begin withdrawal. And just like that, the black fleet that had shaken the galaxy began to vanish back into the void, the same silence with which it had arrived. No conquering banners. No monuments. Just cold, efficient finality. The message they left behind would outlive them for centuries. Mocking humanity had been their first mistake. Thinking humanity wouldn't answer had been their last.